Hi, this is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute, and I'm coming to you on an important day. It is March 12th, and this was a day 6 years ago in which the world changed. I changed, everything changed dramatically. 6 years ago, it was the last year of the Trump administration, and everybody somehow forgets this. Republicans don't want to talk about it, Democrats don't want to talk about it, but the COVID lockdowns began within the last year of the Trump administration, in which he seemingly inexplicably authorized policies that utterly wrecked what appeared to be a fairly healthy economy and changed life in America forever. And we're still recovering from it. Every day we get more news of sickness, of illiteracy, functional illiteracy among people denied a year or two of education, digital addiction. I don't have to go through all the disasters that have come out of this COVID period. And a lot of what Trump did in his last year was continued and intensified under Biden. So both parties are really culpable for having done what they did, not just the United States, but inspired many other countries. In fact, 194 countries around the world to pursue the same policies. March 12th was an important day in the trajectory of time because it was on this day that Trump went on a live broadcast to the nation. It was late in the evening, as I recall, and announced that travel would be banned to Europe, New Zealand, and Australia, and the UK, and that all Americans living abroad needed to come home by Monday. If I recall correctly, this would have been a Thursday night. I think this is a Thursday now. So it was a dark time. It was a strange video because he didn't seem himself at all. It almost seemed like I've described it as a hostage video in a way. He was saying things that he clearly knew more than he was saying, I should say. And he wasn't his usual ebullient self. There weren't any jokes. He was reading from a teleprompter. At one point, he actually misread the teleprompter and said that the bans on travel would also apply to bans on goods coming and going. What he meant to say is that it does not apply to goods. And the White House had to correct the transcript afterwards. And the only way you can hear the original is by going to the YouTube version, which still exists. March 12th was the day. That was when everything began to unfold in catastrophic ways. Americans rushed home. They had to buy extremely expensive tickets. Hundreds of thousands of people, all living abroad on vacation or maybe in school or on contract working abroad, and had to rush home. Nothing like this had ever happened in American history, where suddenly Americans didn't really, that our right to travel was suddenly taken away from us. Nothing like this had ever happened. In World War II, there were bans on travel to Italy and Germany. Not that we needed them, but there were those. And then in World War I, there were some targeted travel bans for enemies in a war. But nothing like this. We weren't at war with Europe or weren't at war with Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. But suddenly, Americans, they weren't allowed to come to the United States. And those same countries reciprocated and said, okay, Americans aren't allowed to come here. So if you have a relative that was living in the UK or a friend, they weren't allowed to come see you. Even engaged partners were separated for nearly a year during this period. I forgot to mention, of course, China. Right, that was the big travel ban was against China, but that had already taken place, and this was an extension. So essentially, the entire world shut down, and all international travel shut down, except for official business. So you could get permission from the White House as a dignitary or whatever from Spain, from Germany, from London, um, and fly to the U.S. You'd be alone on the flight, but this is what happened. Now, this was an important moment because I would like to just take you back in time slightly, um, march through the trajectory of time as it unfolded. It was late January where the news was starting to fill up in American media about a new virus in China. And I worried about this at the time because I had done a lot of research on pandemic planning. I knew what they were capable of doing. I knew that quarantine powers were vast and that an administrative state had many people within it who believed that the way to deal with a new virus was through lockdowns. And so I wrote on January 20th an article saying, we don't need government to save us from the coronavirus. This is a fast mutating virus, and everyone will get it. And our immune systems will adapt, and it will be gone. And that's what I wrote. I said, if government actually attempts to do what some of the pandemic planners want us to do, that they'll permanently discredit public health and everything and everybody associated with it, and it will cause an economic calamity. In January and in February, Trump was echoing some very much a similar thought. You can go through his Twitter profile at the time and see that he was saying that this is going to be seasonal, it's going to pass, we'll be able to deal with it. Flu kills a lot of people too. If you get sick, go see your doctor, but we need to stop panicking, which is exactly the message that public health had delivered for a century. Whether it was a polio epidemic in the 1940s or the 57-58 flu or the 68-69 flu or the parrot flu of 1929, and even 1918 pandemic, there were some local lockdowns, but nothing from the federal government. And New York City and many other cities just continued on as normal. A lot of death, but it came and it went, and human beings adapted to the new microbial kingdom. And after the 1918 pandemic, public health in this country had decided that the worst thing you could ever do is panic in the event of a pandemic. And so the New York Times always just recommended that if you get sick, see a doctor. We've got medical expertise. And that's pretty much what everybody was saying throughout February. You could read it in all the mainstream journals, whether it's Psychology Today or Salon or the medical journals. And even Fauci was saying, don't panic. We're going to get through this just fine. In late February, the CCP organized a junket that was attended by NIH officials in the U.S., including Clifford Lane, who's Fauci's deputy assistant, and other officials from the U.S., many top scientists of the World Health Organization, and top public health officials in the UK and in Europe. Despite the travel ban that was already in place to China, flew on chartered planes to Wuhan, and were given tours of that city and 3 or 4 other cities to illustrate just how well the CCP had dealt with the coronavirus within its own borders, thanks to the leadership of Xi Jinping. And they gave him this tour and said, see, look, we locked everybody in their homes. We had complete shutdowns. We had travel bans. We closed all venues. And we made the virus go away. See? And US and European officials were very impressed by this and wrote a report. Sorry. They wrote a report on the way back and distributed it to the world from the World Health Organization, congratulating Xi Jinping on his brilliant management of the pandemic. And I believe that date might have been something like February 26th when that report came out, and that meant that the lockdowns were in the cards, and it was done. Even then, Trump was resisting. He resisted all the way up to, I think, the last tweet he sent that made any sense was something like March 8th. On March 10th, he changed. Trump changed. And he sent out a message to Twitter that said he was going to use all powers of federal government to do whatever is necessary to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. And that was the shift. Somebody got to him. Something changed on March 10th. It was already in the works. Now it was just a matter of gradually unfolding the bad news one day at a time. And so on March 12th was the great panic over travel and the rush to get back in the U.S. So Americans spent thousands of dollars on tickets, came back to the U.S., and entered into crowded airports in Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Atlanta. Some of the waits in line at customs were up to 8 hours, where people are standing shoulder to shoulder during a time when we are already being told to socially distance and stay home and stay away from other people because we're going to spread a virus. And so now suddenly you had tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans flying from all over the world, panicking, rushing to get within the borders where they would be trapped for the next year, standing next to each other, of course, very likely spreading SARS-CoV-2 all over the place. So it was just the first sign of, intentions conflicting with realities, and it was a sign and a symbol of what was to come. Every single decision made over the rest of Trump's term led to calamity for his entire first term, and for the government, for the economic life, and for civil society in general, not just here but all around the world. Also on March 12th, the CDC put on its website a very important change. It said that all voting, imagine this, voting should take place with mail-in ballots. Now, this didn't come from any legislation. Congress never approved this. I don't think the Trump administration necessarily approved it. The CDC on its own made one website change that it sent out to all public health county public health agencies, cities all over the country, telling the entire nation that mail-in ballots would be the new way we would go about elections. So here you have the CDC interrupting fundamental voting protocols. America's has a democratic system, and how we vote is how we are ruled. Presumably, it's the one great contribution America made to the world. We would have a government by the people. It's been well known for decades going back that mail-in ballots are extremely insecure. They're banned in most countries. Those where they're allowed, you have to have extreme protocols. It's delivered to you you have to have a good reason for it. It's delivered to you in secure envelopes, and every effort is made to stop ballot frauds. We had no kind of systems like that in place in this country. So you had the CDC essentially overthrowing fundamental rules of American democracy, which is to say they engaged in a coup against who we are as a nation on that day, this day, 6 years ago. And I seriously doubt that anybody with the Trump administration even knew about this change. But there it was. And I have an article on brownstone.org in which I screenshot that change. And of course now, all these years later, most Americans think that the 2020 election was in some sense rigged or unfair, or that it was wrongly decided. I've come around to the view that that's likely true. I don't know how you'd know, but the amount of ballot fakery in that year but it broke all records. We'd never seen anything like it. And you recall the election that night, the betting odds showed Trump having won at 95% certainty. Then you wake up the next morning and it had flipped the other direction, that Biden had won with 95% certainty. So something was definitely going on that night. But let's go back. So here we are, March 12th. Trump's announcing travel restrictions, and the CDC saying we're going to have mail-in ballots. The very next day, which I believe was Friday, we had the HHS implement what's called PANCAP adapted, which is the pandemic planning document calling for all sorts of school closures, business closures, stay-at-home orders, social restrictions of all sorts. Now, it's very difficult to figure out what happened on the 14th and the 15th because I think I've read all existing autobiographical accounts of this period, of these days, from Birx, from Fauci, from Kushner, from Pence. They've all written stories about this, and they're all sort of on the same page. They say that Trump was resisting lockdowns, but they talked him into it on the 14th and 15th, that they met privately in the White House. And there's conflicting accounts on precisely who was there. There's very strange books, because these books all are self-aggrandizing. They show Pence saying, "Oh, it was his great idea. He's the one who came up with this thing and came up with that thing and told the president, oh, we have to do this." Then the president complied. Birx says that she was the one. Fauci says that he was the guy. Kushner claims that none of the protocols that ended up governing our lives had been even written, and that he grabbed a couple of two old college roommates who were in medical data fields, and they wrote the protocols for the COVID lockdown. So we don't actually know what's true, but this much we know for sure. Trump knew already on the 12th what was coming. There's no question about it. So I don't believe any of these accounts. They were not dragging a reluctant Trump into the White House on the 13th and 14th and 15th and talking him into this. That just simply didn't happen. So something else happened. We don't know what it was. Certainly, Trump had changed and decided he was going to go along with the lockdowns on March 10th. March 13th, the pandemic plan was put in place. The weekend, they got all their ducks lined up, and then on the 16th, this was on Monday, we got the great press conference with Trump and Birx and Fauci and various military officials standing around, and Trump announced that he was going to shut the economy. Everything was going to be shut down, and that we would get through this and minimize the number of infections, and that everything was going to be great thanks to his great leadership. This really happened under Trump, and people say, oh, well, it wasn't Trump that locked us down. It was the states. Well, okay, but Trump pushed the states into locking down. He specifically demanded that everybody stop doing what they're doing and just hide from the virus, with the exception of essential employees. And just to put a fine point on it, so he didn't really have the authority to close public schools or even restaurants in your community, of course. I mean, states could have gone their own way, but you were risking his wrath by doing so. So in effect, he was the guy. And just to make sure, one thing he did control was military bases, for sure, right? Those under the responsibility of the federal government. He imposed stay-at-home orders. He blocked all worship on military bases, so you couldn't go to church. You couldn't worship with others on military bases. So, he was very much on board with this. And then, just to underscore the point, a few months later, when Georgia started wanting to open, and then Florida started wanting to open, Trump yelled and said that you can't open without the authority of the president, that he's in charge of the whole thing. So he was taking credit for nationwide lockdowns. It's very strange to me when you have these sort of, dedicated Trump fans. They've done this to me for years, saying Trump didn't lock down anything. That was the states that did that. He was against the lockdowns. That's just emphatically not true. That's not what the the record shows. On the March 16th press conference, there was a strange moment where somebody from the press asked him, wait a minute, are you saying that all bars and restaurants in the country need to close? And Trump said, well, we're not really saying that yet. And then somebody nudges him, and then he invites Burks up to talk. And Burks gets to the microphone, and it's a very interesting moment because you can tell that she wanted to say something, but was kind of afraid to say what she was supposed to say. So she began to deflect with some kind of prattle about, oh, you see the data, you see what you've looked at the data, and began to kind of improvise. At which point Fauci gets frustrated. Pokes at her. She gets the message, and she says, oh, Tony wants to speak. He's my boss. I always defer to him. So she didn't do her job. She was supposed to say the thing. She couldn't get it out. There was like a frog in her throat. She was scared. Probably she didn't want to say what was clearly on the piece of paper that had been distributed to the entire press, which was that, yes, all bars and restaurants must close. Anyone where there's any kind of community gatherings have to be shut down. Concerts, libraries, life itself. That was printed on the back side in tiny print in what looks like a footnote on the back side of the sheet of paper that was handed out to the press. So Fauci gets frustrated with Burks, like, what's wrong with you? This was not according to plan. So Fauci steps up to the microphone and says, if you turn over your piece of paper, look in very small print, read what the CDC says. And he read the sentence. All bars and restaurants or anywhere else where communities, where people gather, must be closed, should be closed. And then he walked away from the microphone. While he was saying these words, Trump is off to the side, to his left, and somebody in the audience gets his attention. And he looks at them and says, like waves at them, gestures and to them in some way, gets it, as if to make the point that he was not hearing what Fauci was saying. Now, I've always wondered, who was that? Was that supposed to unfold that way? Somebody distracting Trump from the great moment when Fauci read the lockdown orders? Or did Trump not want to be culpable for the edict that he had just issued, wanted to distance himself from it for some reason, and that the distraction during that moment was a setup? I don't know how anybody would know. I've watched this scene many times, and I can't really make sense of it. I don't understand why nobody else cares. You'd think people would be researching this. This is the moment when all of history changed. Do you think that there'd be some interest in exactly what happened? Who wrote those words? Was Burke supposed to read them? And Fauci got frustrated. How come Trump wasn't listening? How come he was looking the other way? I don't know. But he leaves. Now Fauci leaves the podium and invites Trump back up again. And Trump, almost in an absent-minded way, goes, oh, I guess I'm back on. And he kind of moves his head in a funny way, as if he didn't hear, like he was bored or something. And by the way, I think this happened during the Q&A section. It wasn't during the main part of the press conference. The question was when the press was answering questions. So it was quite deep in, and Trump was already sort of getting bored. And that was it. So the nation locked down. CDC was now the dictator of America, or whoever was actually running the CDC. We just really don't know. The next day, We got the edict from the from CISA, CISA, which is Cyber Security Information Security Agency, which is a division of the Homeland Security Department, the head of whom used to work for the National Security Agency, which itself is a spinoff of CIA. So basically, the CIA issued a PDF, sent it out to every business in America that said, you need to decide if you're, actually, it didn't say you need to decide. They said, a new plan is going to run this country. We have essential employees and unessential employees. Here are the essential employees, and here are the unessential employees. And so you had to look through it to find out which you were, to find out whether and to what extent you could actually go about your business, show up to work, be on the highways. Nobody actually knew for sure. And also, was this law? Was it enforced? What if you defied it? Were there fines? Nobody said, and nobody really knew. It felt very much like martial law. Now, I was at the point of absolutely despairing at this point. Like, the sun didn't come up in the morning, or I didn't want it to. When it did, I would curse it because I couldn't believe what was happening. I thought, surely this will stop in a week or two. They were talking about 2 weeks to stop the spread, 15 days to flatten the curve, or whatever the line was. But already the censorship had grown very intensely, so that my own content wasn't getting through. I couldn't find anybody who seemed to agree, who disagree with what the administration was doing. There was information controls were very much implemented from the beginning. I got a call maybe 2 or 3 weeks into this. And as you know, what happened here was that Trump had planned to lock down for 2 weeks, and then when it opened up, Birx came to him and said, look, you've made so much progress in the meantime. If you open up now, you're going to throw it all away. So we need another 30 days. So he did acquiesce to this, blasting right past his own stated goal of opening by Easter. So that was not even a thing. That sort of went away. Easter didn't happen that year, first time since the birth of Christendom. Eastern celebrations were essentially banished. Again, all under Trump. With his knowledge, with his agreement, without it, who was pushing him? Was this something he wanted? We still don't have answers to these questions. Here we are 6 years later, and we still don't know. I have in my own mind a scenario in which somebody came to him and said, Mr. President, look what Xi Jinping did in China. He got the World Health Organization report. It's right here. Look at, all your top people went there and saw how China dealt with this virus, and they had a magnificent success. If he can do that, you can too. And we have every reason to think that this might have come from this might be a bioweapon from China. And China avoided the consequences of this terrible bioweapon by locking its citizens down. And now they're happy and free. If you want to beat China, you will do the same thing. And if Xi Jinping, who's now celebrated as a great hero, look, the World Health Organization's cheering him on, saying what a great job it did. He's a genius. You too, Mr. President, can do the same thing. You have the power. You have the ability. And there's another piece of the story. By the way, what I just told you, there's no evidence of it. It's just what I consider to be the most likely scenario. There's another piece of this too, and it involves the great inoculation, right? The vaccine. I think it's highly likely, again, without evidence, that Trump was told that an antidote was coming to this virus, that a countermeasure was being invented in record time thanks to a new technology called mRNA. It can be put through the lab. The virus has already been sequenced back in January, so they're hard at work. We've got some great entrepreneurs busy. Pfizer, Moderna, others. They're going to come out with a great inoculation. We're going to get it distributed by the summer. or maybe even sooner. And everybody in America will get it. And nobody will die. And we'll have avoided this bioweapon from China. And then Trump will be heralded as the greatest president in history, greater than Lincoln, greater than FDR, like a new founding father of the new biologics age, giving us a new mRNA technology. Did that actually happen? I don't know, but I think it's a very plausible scenario. I think it's very likely, because I don't understand how otherwise Trump would have just destroyed his entire economy, all of his achievements just overnight, just throw them all down. And they flattered him that he's got the power to do it. He's got the genius to do it. He's got the best advisors. And now we've got tremendous private enterprise getting to work with the new technology that's going to protect the entire population. And so that we'll give China a thing or two. So yeah, this is crazy, but this I think was what happened. Now I got a call, I'm going to say like 3 or 4 weeks into this, where I had been, writing frantically as much as I possibly could against this. And this guy calls me named Rajiv Venkaya. I knew about him. He used to work for the Gates Foundation. Now works for a vaccine company. But I knew him from my previous writings all the way back in 2005 and 2006, that he was the innovator, the inventor of pandemic planning, the idea that we can have a central plan to deal with the microbial kingdom, and crush it, thanks to social distancing and non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is all we were using up at that time, non-pharmaceutical interventions. There's a reason for the word non-pharmaceutical interventions. It's not just that they're not pharmaceutical, it's that they're pre-pharmaceutical, right? So that's, people start calling them MPMs, but actually they're pre-pharmaceutical interventions. This is what you're going to do in advance of the vaccine, right? So he called me on the phone and said, "Listen, you really need to shut up about this. Everything's going according to plan. You're over here raging against the lockdowns. Oh, you can't travel here. Oh, the hospitals are shut down. Hospital parking lots are empty. You're complaining about the schools being closed. So your religious freedoms and all this stuff." He said, "You don't understand. We've got this all under control." I said, "Okay, well, that's very interesting, Rajiv, but answer me one question. Where does the virus go? It's not as if it's afraid of Fauci and Trump. It's not going to just jump in a hole or take a spaceship to outer space and disappear. Every virus that's ever existed still exists, with the exception of like smallpox, which is eradicated. And even that still exists. So what are you going to do with this virus?" And he said, "Don't worry, we're going to have a vaccine." Now, this is the first time I had heard about this. And the reason I wasn't hip to this is because Fauci was on the record already in telling the Washington Post that we didn't need a vaccine to get out of this pandemic, that we would get out of it through social distancing, which I don't know what that means, like forever, living under our sofas, staying 6 feet away from our fellow man who's now been re-rendered as a vector of disease. Forget human rights, everybody's dangerous, right? We have to stay away from everybody. But Fauci said we didn't. To this day, I don't know why Fauci told the Washington Post this, because he knew there was a vaccine in development. So I don't know. Was it deflection? I don't know. So many shadows, so many mirrors. Wilderness of mirrors, as they say. So he said, "Well, there's going to be a vaccine." I just laughed. And I just said to him, I said, "Rajiv, you can't. There's no way to vaccinate against a coronavirus, a respiratory illness that mutates very quickly. And in any case, there's a zoonotic reservoir, meaning that the animals get it. Mammals are going to have COVID-2. This isn't going anywhere, and you can't vaccinate against such a thing. At least we've never been able to in the past. I don't see how it's even possible. It's not possible. It's not biologically possible to vaccinate against this particular pathogen. And in any case, if you're going to distribute a shot, it would need to be in trials for 5 or 10 years or longer before it could be safely given to the population and proven effective. And he said to me, oh no, it's going to happen a lot faster than that. At which point I thought, who's this has been? Who's telling me nonsense on the phone? He must be past his prime or 3 martinis deep. Something's wrong with this guy. Hung up the phone and forgot about the phone call. But I didn't know at the time is that he had told me the entire plan. The entire plan was to stay locked down until they could test a new shot. Now, if I'm correct about what they told Trump, Trump expected the vaccine to come much sooner. It didn't come. In fact, his enemies and the bureaucracy, the deep state, whatever, had every intention to wait to distribute the shot until after the election. I think this was the plan all along. It was part of a scheme to get rid of him. At some point, he figured this out. And instead of exposing it and telling the public that he'd been tricked, he just went out on the campaign trail. This is following, as you recall, the BLM riots that dominated the summer headlines. The first protests against racism, I'm not against that. It's great. It was a chance for people to get out, say something right and true, whatever. Young people had been sort of holed up in their bedrooms and dorm rooms for months. So this is a chance to let off a little steam. Mutated into terrible riots, during which time the nation's press said, well, it's okay they're doing this because there's a pandemic even worse than COVID, which is the pandemic of racism. And they're not spreading the virus because they're all wearing masks. I mean, this is the level of gaslighting that we had to deal with throughout the summer months. And then, of course, then the summer ended and we were back into lockdowns. And so it was for September, October, all the way to the election. Trump himself had long ago, didn't want to talk about COVID through all of August and September. Just dropped the subject completely, almost like he believed that if he didn't say anything about it on the campaign trail and didn't think about it and just told everybody to forget about COVID, that it would go away. Meanwhile, all towns were in shambles. Businesses were boarded up. Nurses were being furloughed all over the country. There was a trauma so unspeakable that it's hard to recreate it. Travel restrictions between states. I mean, during this time, you had to quarantine on either side of borders, which made things very awkward in places where the states are small, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York. Going from one state to the next, you would get a text on your phone from the sheriff saying, be sure and quarantine while you're there and don't come back until you've been there 2 weeks. This is happening. Scott Atlas made his way to the White House during this time in August and began to talk some sense into Trump. Scott Atlas is a very brave man. He stood up to Fauci, to Birx, to the entire military industrial intelligence community that was wandering the halls at the time and just told them the truth. And what was the truth? I mean, it's just plain public health wisdom. Lockdowns are terrible. It's going to do more harm than good. This virus will get through it through mostly natural immunity. Maybe a shot comes along, maybe it doesn't, but in any case, this will pass. It's a seasonal virus. And he became very good friends with Trump during this time, and Trump realized that he had been trolled. Well, at some point, Trump was hospitalized for contracting COVID. It was, I think, early October, if my memory serves. Went into the hospital. We don't know what happened. What he took. I mean, there's various reports. Was it remdesivir? Was it which is the drug also known as run, death is near? I mean, it's a very dangerous drug. Was he given that? I don't know. Some people speculate that maybe, yeah, I'm not going to fill in the rest of that sentence. You can fill it in your own mind. Was he giving ivermectin, and that's what made him better? Was there an argument in the hospital over how to treat this? Did somebody want to ventilate him and more than 9 in 10 people who got on a ventilator died. Well, we don't know, but he emerged from that, and he was a changed man. And that's when he went to the balcony and tore off his mask and said, "Don't be afraid of COVID." He was a completely new man. But I'm certain by this time he realized that he'd been trolled. So he got back on the campaign trail. The Great Barrington Declaration came out a few days later. And I've talked about that before, so I won't talk about that now. But he went back on the campaign trail, didn't talk about COVID. And the entire country is in suffering and trauma and shock and horror, and censorship was everywhere. We didn't know what we were allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do. All movie theaters were closed. Churches still weren't open. Everything was still shut down, and travel was still blocked, right? And Trump is out on the campaign trail talking about how our showers don't work anymore because of flow stoppers from government regulations. A subject that's really important to me, about which I'd written a lot, but this is not exactly the context in which this was resonating very heavily. In any case, the mail-in ballots started to come about, and the election was essentially decided before it was over. I mean, thanks to mail-in ballots that had been permissioned 6 years ago on March 12th. Trump left office. We had the January 6th fiasco in Washington. I'm not going to go through that. But Trump used to say that the election was stolen from him. I remember thinking, oh, he's just a sore loser. That's not what we do in America. Even when the umpire makes a bad call, you still have to live with the results. But as time has gone on, I think maybe he had a legitimate grievance about that election. But it was the perfect time at this point. We're talking about, December, January, before Biden took the oath of office, that I thought everything would have come to an end. That if indeed the purpose of all this COVID fiasco was to drive him out of office, they accomplished their goals. So why not just let it go? But I had missed a piece. I didn't understand this. In fact, it took me a better part of 2 years to understand this. To understand and believe what Rajiv had told me in a phone call in April, which is the whole point of the lockdowns, was to prepare the population for the shots. To keep people apart so they wouldn't acquire natural immunity, to preserve immunological naivety as long as possible. That's the reason for the masks, for the distancing, for the closures, so that the only way out, that was the reason for the banning of therapeutics, why you couldn't get ivermectin at your local pharmacy, or hydroxychloroquine, which everybody knew was effective, antiviral. I mean, the British Empire knew that. That's why gin and tonics were always the drink of choice in the British Empire. This was not knowledge people didn't have. Everybody knew this. But they were taken off the market. The reason was they wanted one solution only, which was a shot that had been indemnified against all harm. So it didn't need to be safety tested, because even if it wasn't a safe shot, it wouldn't matter. The companies were not held liable for it. If you got sick and died, your survivors couldn't sue Pfizer, Moderna. They were indemnified. There was a liability shield for them. So they were good to go. They had a lot of money to be made, a lot of shots to be distributed. The reason why the panic did not subside after Biden became president was because the uptake of the shots was so low. People just didn't want them. It was obvious from the very beginning that the only people who were really profoundly vulnerable to this particular pathogen were the aged and the infirm. If anybody needed the shots, it was they. Now, that's what logic would tell you. I've revised my own opinion about this. The shot was never safe. So the last people you want to get this thing would be the aged and the infirms. The vulnerable populations should have been the target in a way, but also on the other hand, that's the worst possible population to test out a new technology, mRNA, on. It was potentially devastating for them. But the reason why Biden continued it was because the uptake was so low. So the whole point of destroying the country, destroying the stock market, demoralizing the population, denying kids their education, sending the entire country in upheaval, basically throwing the Bill of Rights in the trash, was to maximize the uptake of the vaccine, where they wanted universal vaccination. The uptake was too low, so the mandate started to roll out. Okay, it has to be to every corporation in America, all healthcare workers, everybody in the military. This ended up being challenged by Supreme Court. Supreme Court said you can't do this for private businesses, but you can do it for healthcare workers. So it was basically an incoherent decision, but it didn't even matter because by that time, all the large companies, the HR departments had all received orders from the public health agencies, and they implemented these mandates again without any kind of liability. So Goldman Sachs makes all their employees get the injection. Goldman Sachs couldn't be held responsible for having done this to people because they would have normally thrown the liability back to the maker, but the maker didn't have any liabilities. This was not a normal market product. Well, I tell the story, which I know too well. I probably left out some pieces along the way. I tell the story because, well, nobody really tells the story. It's very strange because still the impression to this day is that Trump had never taken COVID seriously, that he didn't really do what he was supposed to do, which is to lock down soon and hard to stop the coronavirus. That's what everybody says. The fact is that he did. From March 10th onwards, he was all in with the pandemic plan, which was roughly an American version of what happened in China. So Trump's never accepted any responsibility for this. He thinks he deserves credit for Operation Warp Speed, which got us a vaccine in record time. He thinks he handled everything beautifully. Now, I know as a businessman, that's part of the shtick, right, of being a big businessman. You never make mistakes. Any mistake you admit will ruin your credit rating for the future. And you're always borrowing money, living off leverage. So you always have to pretend as if everything you do is perfect so you can borrow the maximum amount and maintain your credit rating. Nobody would voluntarily, you would not admit to your bank that you paid a bill late. If they didn't catch it, then that's good, because if you admit it, then your credit rating goes down, right? So Trump thinks of all of life like this. Like any error he admits is going to reduce his credibility with the public. So he's never spoken about it. And even there's only a handful of interviews in which anybody grills him about this at all. What happened? And he doesn't really remember. He skips over some details. He says things that aren't quite accurate. And the people who have had access to him on the subject don't know the subject well enough to ask him in detail. So he's somehow gotten away with this. So to this day, people think Trump had a laissez-faire attitude towards the coronavirus, and that it took Fauci, Birx, and then finally Biden to take the right approach. Anyway, his first term was wrecked through this very strange decision-making. Now, here we are, 6 years later to the day. U.S. is at war with Iran, although it's not called a war. The war is spreading, and the bombs are falling. Billions have been expended. $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, $5 billion. Every day this goes on. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. The price of oil just went up to $100. It's not going down. There's now speculation that Strait of Hormuz will be closed for another couple of months. It's now fully under the control of Iran, contradicting everything that Trump has said. Gasoline is higher than it has been in 18 months, higher than when Trump took office. So his most prized achievement, which is bringing down the price of oil and policy goal of repealing the Green New Deal and drill, baby, drill was to lower the price of energy. All of that is gone. It's all been thrown away. And I'm speaking to you now just about 2 hours after Trump posted on Truth Social that the great thing about high oil prices is that America makes a lot of money from them. Yeah, that's where we are. So the campaign promises of 2024, peaceful relations with other nations, a strong nation, minding its own business, no nation building, certainly no invasion no war against Iran. We're going to make deals with countries, not squander American lives and treasure on far-flung adventures that have nothing to do with the U.S. We repeal the Green New Deal. We get rid of all the climate change protocols. We deregulate the economy and drill, baby, drill, depend more and more on oil and inexpensive energy, and that will drive down inflation. And because, as Trump said many times, I think wrongly, that energy prices are are sort of the push basis of inflation. If we get energy prices down, then everything else falls. And just yesterday, he was speaking with a sign above his head that said, "Lower prices, high incomes." There's only one good I can think of that, speaking today, that's lower price now than when he took office, and that's eggs. And he deserves credit for that. God bless his egg policy. What can I tell you? Everything else is higher. He no longer has bragging rights over gas. He no longer has bragging rights that he's kept us out of war, that he's brought peace. He wanted the Nobel Peace Prize, and now he's involved in a war that is already injuring and killing Americans and betraying his own principles. So I ask you, concerning this Iran conflict and all the ways in which it contrasts with the campaign promises, what does this remind you of? I think you know the answer. This is the Trump who, in the fourth year of his first term, destroyed the economy that he built, ruined his reputation, and doubled back on all of his campaign promises to get rid of the deep state, to drain the swamp, to bring back the Constitution and American freedom. We suddenly found ourselves in the fourth year of the first term living under a dystopian totalitarianism that we never imagined possible in America. Getting through that, a lot of people forgave him that, even though he never talked about it. And he was elected to bring peace, lower prices, deregulation, the Constitution, drain the swamp, get rid of the deep state. And here we are. Here we are. Well, that's all in for today. And thanks for spending time with me on this terrifying retrospective from which we can surely learn a thing or two. Don't give up. Don't give up hope, my friends. Thank you.